Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're heading back in time, way back to Victorian Manchester. We're going to uncover the hidden truth behind a place with a legendary and pretty terrifying reputation. Angel Meadow, supposedly the worst slum in all of England.
And really, it's this single, powerful description from a young Friedrich Engels that pretty much cemented that legend. His words, they painted a picture so vivid, so bleak, that Angel Meadow became known as a true hell upon earth. And you see, images just like this one, which were actually published decades later, they just hammered home that same story, one of filth and just complete despair. But here's the thing. What if that's not the whole story? What if the legend that we all think we know is actually based on a very selective truth?
Okay, so let's dig into that legend, right? It's this incredibly powerful story of just unimaginable squalor and industrial horror. And honestly, it's a story that has shaped how we see the entire Industrial Revolution for, over 150 years.
His book, The Condition of the Working Class in England, it was a total game changer, a landmark piece of political writing. And he put Angel Meadow front and center. It was his prime exhibit, the ultimate example of the failures and the brutal human cost of industrial capitalism.
And this is where it gets really interesting. When we actually go back and retrace Engels' steps through 1840s Manchester, a much more selective, you could almost say curated picture starts to come into focus.
So take a look at this map. What it shows is pretty mind-blowing. Engels' entire damning account, the one that defined a whole district for generations, was based on this tiny, narrow sliver of land, just this one little pocket right next to the incredibly polluted River Irk.
He specifically chose to walk through and write about these places, these dense, isolated courts like Allen's Court you see here. And look, let's be crystal clear. These places were legitimately some of the worst pockets of housing in the entire city. So he wasn't making up the squalor, not at all. But he was very deliberately choosing where to look for it. And get this, if you do a line-by-line comparison, Engels' writing is strikingly similar to a report written more than a decade earlier by a Dr. James Phillips Kay. So what does that suggest? It kind of feels like he wasn't just observing things fresh. He was almost following a pre-written script, looking for the exact evidence that would best fit the argument he wanted to make.
Okay, so if Engels only showed us this one very specific, very grim corner of Angel Meadow, what was going on in the rest of it? What did poverty in life look like just a few streets over?
Well, this is where archaeology and historical records have uncovered a surprisingly different reality. Turns out, if you just walked a little bit away from the river, the whole architecture of the neighborhood changed, and pretty dramatically. It just wasn't one big, uniform slum.
And these two images illustrate that contrast perfectly. On the one hand, you've got that popular image of the old, crumbling, medieval-style housing. But on the other hand, you can see the other Angel Meadow, these big, substantial, three-story Georgian houses that were actually all over the district.
These bigger houses were a whole world away from the cattle sheds Engels was talking about. These were built back in the late Georgian era for skilled workers, weavers, shoemakers, tailors. These were folks who needed good space, lots of light, and a respectable address. They even had fancy details, like proper decorative doorways. But, and this is a really important but, that doesn't mean life was easy in these better-built houses. Not at all. The poverty just took on a totally different form. See, the real crisis wasn't about the quality of the buildings themselves, but the sheer quantity of people they crammed inside. So what happened was, as the industrial boom just exploded, those original artisan families, they moved out to the newer suburbs. And the landlords? They saw an opportunity. They took these big, solid houses and just carved them up, renting out single rooms, entire floors, even the cellars, to the massive waves of new workers who were flooding into Manchester.
Which brings us to a really crucial point, and it's all in this one number, 29. By 1861, census records show that just one of these large, once respectable houses on Angel Street was home to 29 different people.
And if you look at the breakdown for that one house, it's wild. You had just one family of 4 who were the head of the household. The other 25 residents? They were all lodgers, strangers with no family connection, all crammed together, sharing the same tiny space, breathing the same air, and using the same, very few, amenities.
In this map here, it shows the absolutely devastating consequences. It's from a cholera outbreak, and each one of those black dots marks a death. You can literally see the epicenters of the disease flaring up on the exact streets where these overcrowded lodging houses were. It proves a chilling point. Extreme density was every bit as deadly as poor construction.
So, okay, why does any of this matter? Why bother correcting a 180-year-old story about a slum that's long gone? What's the point of adding all this nuance back into the history of poverty?
It matters because Engels' account, while definitely rooted in fact, was also a brilliant piece of political storytelling. It had a very clear purpose. It took a complex, varied reality and flattened it into a simple, shocking, and unbelievably powerful symbol of capitalist exploitation, a symbol that has echoed for centuries.
The real story of Angel Meadow shows us that poverty wasn't just one thing. It was varied, it was complicated, and it was often hyper-localized. Realizing that insane overcrowding, even in once good houses, created a totally different kind of slum. That's a super important lesson when we study not just history, but the challenges of urban poverty today.
And that kind of leaves us with one last big thought to chew on. How does a powerful, selective story become the accepted version of history? I think this story of Angel Meadow teaches us that sometimes the loudest, the most shocking, and maybe the most politically useful voices are the ones that can completely drown out a more complicated and maybe even a more useful truth.